Hi, my name is Winsley, and welcome to my video on how accuracy in Age of Wonders 4 works in the Wolf update. The devs recently changed two things about how accuracy works. They made it so that the system now checks for fumbles before it checks for any crits. This means that having a high crit chance will no longer protect you from fumbles, and the system will now roll critical and fumble before each separate attack instead of once before an attack sequence, which basically means single action attacks are unchanged, but repeating attacks that would have had just one crit chance for all three repeating attacks now will do one for each of the individual repeating attacks. I figured after seeing those changes that now might be a really good opportunity to go back and talk about how accuracy actually works in game, because the in game encyclopedia does not do a great job of telling you how accuracy works. It does mention that it's basically going to tell you if an attack is going to land, miss, or graze, where grazes will do half damage, misses deal no damage, and misses can hit random adjacent targets. But it doesn't mention that some attacks have the always hit uh, thing, which means that they don't have an accuracy test, but they do have a fumble check that they make, which can lead to grazes on those types of attacks. There's a lot going on here, but basically, the way it works is it checks four things. If an attack does not have the always hit tag, it's going to check the fumble chance first. And if it fails the fumble check, basically it will downgrade attacks later on. So if it was going to be a regular hit, that will be downgraded to a graze. And if it was going to be a graze, attack would be downgraded to a miss. After it checks the fumble chance, it checks the critical chance. So if something doesn't fumble, then I believe it can crit, dealing the 50% extra damage. And after that, then it will look at the actual hit chance on each of the particular rolls. Where if it doesn't hit the hit chance, it then checks the graze chance, which should be 25% higher than the hit chance roll. Basically, it makes one roll for the hit graze miss determination, which then can be altered by the fumble chance. Now that we've talked about this in principle, let's actually look at this in practice. This range unit, the Afflictor, has a couple shots available to it, and if we look at the colors, the red is basically indicating that this is a attack that could miss, or it is an attack that you probably don't want to rely on for damage because it is so likely to just not do any damage. There is a pretty decent chance that this could graze, but I wouldn't rely on a 25% accuracy attack too often, because um, there are things like fumbles and crits that can alter it, but in general, that will just not go through as consistently as, say, like a 75% attack or a 60% attack. Or if you have options to take 100% attack, that's generally a very valuable option. There's a lot more potential damage if you hit all three of your attacks, and even more if you can actually get some crits on them. Now, what's interesting about the yellow indicator on this 75% chance is I would expect this to be green, because when I see green, I think that there is no chance to miss, and that basically if I don't hit, I will graze. And when I look at the 80% here, it is green and there is no chance to miss. I tested that with, uh, uh, and I am 100% certain that there is a 0% chance to miss here. I'm pretty sure there is a 0% chance to miss on the 75% shot, but that is where things start to become more risky. If you go under 75%, then all of a sudden you have to start taking into consideration that some of your attacks might miss and you might end up doing less damage. So moving forward, to take less attacks can be a better way to get a higher amount of damage. Like right here at 60% with 3 attacks, I think 2 at 100% could be better damage. And I think that if we look at this, basically, I was seeing that at 50% accuracy, it is a yellow. And yeah, at 45, that's when the game starts to recommend that you start to consider other options. So I just went through a couple different attacks to try and generate specific situations. This one should miss and actually hit an enemy. Yeah, so I was able to poison an enemy with my missed attack. A 50% chance that has a decent chance of actually hitting an enemy instead of an ally is a good attack to take. Whereas if I'd moved a ally adjacent to that and missed and hit my own ally, that's a really risky shot to take. And the next thing I really wanted to showcase here was basically how if you meet the graze threshold, that counts as a graze, which I think should mean the 75% chances cannot miss. They should always graze. This says you needed a a 30, or you needed a 55 to hit. They rolled a 30, which is 25 less than um, the required dice roll. Once again, this is for a 45% attack, so it needs a 55 or higher on the check here. And if it was a 75% attack, this wouldn't say 55, this would say 25. So even if you rolled as a 0, which I'm not sure you can do, that wouldn't count as a miss. Now that we've covered the basics, we can move on to more advanced aspects of accuracy, like how accuracy actually applies to melee attacks. If we look at this attack, it has a 100% chance to strike, and against most targets, that means it just will hit. But in very few situations, in a select few situations, you will actually have a chance to miss or graze from your accuracy being reduced, and mistlings are quite good at reducing that accuracy through their clinging mist ability. There are ways to get around this, like you can give your guys, I think it's Fey touched to make it so that they can ignore that obscuring on the mist. But generally speaking, like if somebody's standing in a bush or something, it's not harder to hit them. But if they're in mist, that will make it harder for a melee strike to go through. We did talk a little bit about how afflictors just have that attack um, that will hit. They have a always hits attack, and I know we talked a little bit about missing earlier, but I don't believe we talked about scatter. Scatter is something that can occur on this one unit, on this one attack. It says it's got a 50% chance to land its attacks, and typically you would assume that means there is a 25% chance to miss and a 25% chance to grace here. This is actually saying no, there's a 50% chance to scatter, and the scatter radius is 2 hexes away from where the target is. So if I wanted to try and target this group right here, there's a pretty good chance that it would scatter onto a friendly unit because that's only 1 hex away and this is 2. So I can end up hitting 2 of my own units and only hitting 2 enemy units if I say target right there. So you want to be very careful about what you select and how close it is to your allies. Like this seems dangerous. It could actually scatter onto some of my guys, but let's just see where it goes, where it lands. Yeah, it scattered a little bit there, and then I think the next two actually landed on the center hex. So it did scatter, I think, a little bit to the side and didn't actually end up hitting any other units, but it's a pretty risky unit to use. Let's take a second to actually look at another barrage from this ironclad. I've put some of my friendly units nearby, so we should be able to see it scatter into some of those guys. There, it scattered a little bit to the side, and I think it hit my hero. It did scatter a little bit to the side. As you can see from this position, my lesser magma spirit doesn't have a lot of high accuracy percent shots, and one thing you could do is move it so that it is on the opposite side of a friendly unit before it tries to take its attacks. If I look at the actual penalties, it's saying long range penalty obscured by unit. Obscured by unit is different than obscured by foliage. Right now, I think I have one of my units basically in an awkward position. You can see like it turns red over this guy. I think it kind of like draws a line that says this unit's in the way, but if you're standing next to it, it doesn't count as like in the way. So you can get higher accuracy by moving around your friendly units to create formations like this. But the one thing about that is by putting your ranged units closer to the enemy formation, it's going to be easier for them to get like their melee guys on top of that unit, or for their ranged units to shoot your ranged pieces. Before we wrap up this video, I did want to go over a couple accuracy related tips and tricks, like for example, how the Glade Runner has this ability to apply marked, which should make it easier for you to shoot ranged targets from further away, making it so that you reduce accuracy by 10% is not nothing. And it can also make it so if somebody's standing in clinging mist, you can get around some of that clinging mist, or you can get around evasion from other sources. While I mentioned it earlier, I do think it's worth showing off how critical chance is capped by accuracy. You can see this attack is only a 5% chance to hit, and even though my crit chance is supposed to be higher than 5%, it gets dropped down to 5% when I try to take a low accuracy attack. Right now, because my morale is high, I'm getting plus 20%, but only 5 of that would count towards this attack. Another interesting thing to note here is some targets are large targets, like this ironclad is easier to shoot because they have the large target tag. They're 20% easier to hit. While the large target tag is relatively common, the tiny tag here works pretty much the same way and appears on a lot less units. We can see that the Mistling is 20% harder to hit, and if I wanted to try and find other units that are harder to hit, I can't just like type tiny up here, but I do have another resource that I really like to use. I have this database which I can use to look up the tiny tag. We can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units that are tiny for the fairies, a gremlin, and the mistling. And yeah, the fairies are harder to come by. The mistling and the gremlin are tome units. If we wanted to compare this to large targets, we can just put in, I think that, and this is just a list of all the units that have that large target tag. Another interesting thing that I noticed more recently is that because the Primal Darter has less overall range than other ranged attackers, he can shoot from 3 away versus this one who can shoot from 4 away. The long range penalty comes into play a little bit earlier. If we counted the empty hexes, we have 2 here, and then it's basically on the third hex, I have no long range penalty with my Afflictor, but 4 hexes away, I start having the long range penalty. And if I look at the Darter, I start getting the long range penalty at the like 2 empty spaces away or like on the third hex, which is 1 hex earlier. And yeah, you can compare that to like the battle mages and the heroes who I believe they suffer similar range penalties for being far away. And yeah, I think this guy's range attack being a 4 range attack would work the same way if you're 5 hexes away. That's when or rather 3 empty hexes, and on the fourth one, that's when you start to have the long range penalty come into play for most units and most attacks. So I was just checking to see how Twin Awakening, when it adds extra range, would work with the long range penalty, and it looks like if you were able to hit a unit that is 5 units away with an attack that's supposed to have an ideal range of 3 units away, the long range penalty will be applied twice, basically for each hex that you go past the ideal range of the weapon attack. I have to assume that this works the same way it would with the Seeker's Arrows and other ways that would extend a unit's range of attack. The last thing we'll talk about here is how misfortune and fortune relate to one another, which is similar to the way criticals and fumbles work with each other. Misfortune is a buff, which makes it so that a unit has a higher fumble chance, and also when they fumble, they will take damage that can stack up to 3 times. That's kind of normal for buffs. And then fortune would be something that gives you critical chance and nothing extra when you get the critical. And in a way, you get more out of misfortune than you do out of fortune, but the way crits allow you to do more damage in really unique situations makes fortune also very valuable. I think in Age of Wonders Planetfall, your critical chance was reduced by fumble chance, but I think in the way the calculation works in Age of Wonders 4, they kind of tweaked that dynamic and moved it more into the buffs. The buffs are able to counter each other, whereas the critical chance and the fumble chance are just separate calculations. At least that's how I interpret the numbers that I've seen in game. If you feel like I got any aspect of this wrong, or if you've got any recommendations to other players for how to use accuracy, please feel free to leave some comments in the comment section below. I'll see you around. Have a good one.